Bringing you the latest in tax credit news, this is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the March 7th, 2023 podcast. I should probably start off by wishing my son CJ happy birthday. Now, in today's podcast, we resume our So You Want to Be a LIHTC Developer series and discuss some recent housing data that prompted me to write my March column in the Novogradac Journal of Tax Credits. In the column, I compared the number of housing starts over the past few years with the number of new households being formed. The data shows that the nominal national number of single-family and multifamily housing starts over the last 3 years have outpaced the number of net new households being formed. This recent trend is driven in part by the notable upward spike in multifamily housing starts over just the past 2 years, wherein the number of multifamily housing starts were the highest seen since the mid-1980s, since before the Tax Reform Act of 1986. Now, nominally, there were 4.8 million new housing starts over the last 3 years, and this 4.8 million additional housing starts exceeded household formations by 1.4 million homes. However, we should note that this is a very recent trend. If you look back over a 5-year period, not just 3 years, the data shifts. The net new households actually exceed housing starts by 700,000. And going back over a 10-year period, net new households exceed housing starts by 1.7 million households. So basically, over the last 5 to 10 years, new demand has exceeded new supply. Over the last 3 years, it's reversed. Now, I do want to also note these housing starts and household formation figures are national statistics. They are not evenly distributed across the country, across suburban, urban, and rural areas. As such, each community may diverge from these national trends. Furthermore, when you think about the spike in multifamily housing starts over the last 3 years, bear in mind that recently we've experienced some notable inflation, which has led to higher interest rates and higher construction costs, which does mean the recent spike in new housing starts likely will slow in the coming months and years ahead. But I want to get back to my washer wire column, the purpose of this podcast. The question that I addressed was to what extent and how might the recent trend of new supply outstripping new household formation affect affordable rental housing? And on today's podcast, we're going to further explore the effect that combination could have for sponsors, owners, investors, tenants, and other stakeholders in low-income housing tax credit properties. Now, as we address this question, I think it's critical to note that rental rates for low-income housing tax credit properties are significantly below rental rates for market rate properties. And there remains a huge need for more affordable housing in America. Just look to the U.S. Census Bureau. They report that more than 40% of all renters at any income level are rent burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income in housing costs. Once again, that's 40% of all renters are rent burdened. And those figures are significantly worse for low-income Americans, the types of Americans that are eligible for low-income housing tax credit properties. Among extremely low-income renters, 71% of households are severely rent burdened, meaning they spend more than 50% of their income on rent and utilities. That's right, 71% of households are severely rent burdened. That's low-income households. Now, my guest today is my partner, Kelly Gorman, from our Clark, New Jersey office. Kelly has previously been a guest on Tax Credit Tuesday, discussing our annual operating expenses and income report. Today, she's here to share her thoughts on the recent trends in housing starts and household formations, and what she's seeing in her work with affordable housing properties. Kelly's a partner in Novogradac's valuation group and has extensive experience with appraisals, market studies, rent comparability studies, and consulting services for our affordable housing clients. And before coming to Novogradac, Kelly worked as a property manager for a portfolio of properties in Maryland, so she has plenty of experience in property management too. I think you'll see today that she has a great feel for what's happening in affordable rental housing backed by her experience. Now, in today's podcast, we're going to discuss what Kelly is seeing in her work, including whether or not she's seeing any effects on rents for low-income housing tax credit properties. She'll talk about the gap between affordable rents and market rents, as well as what types of housing or areas would be the first to see any impact if there is a significant change that endures in the balance between supply and demand for housing in general. After that, we'll also talk about what might happen if we do experience a recession. Maybe we're already in one. And Kelly will share what she saw during the Great Recession and how the Great Recession affected affordable housing properties. Then we're going to wrap up the discussion with what property owners and sponsors of existing affordable housing and proposed housing should be thinking about in order to address any potential implications of the recent trends in household formations versus new housing starts. This is a big topic. There's a lot to cover. So if you're ready, let's get started. Kelly, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Thanks. It's good to be back. And happy birthday to CJ if he's listening. Does he listen to these?
Yes. Not every week, but
okay.
He's an occasional listener. I'll never listen to this week's podcast.
Have to quiz him at dinner.
So now you work out in the field, visiting properties and the rest virtually every day, conducting market studies and working with affordable housing developers, owners, and investors in a multitude of ways. As I noted in the intro in my column, I highlighted that over the last 3 years, not the last 5 or 10, but the last 3 years, the number of new housing units has exceeded the creation of new households. And I note in the article that market rent levels have dropped a bit in recent months. Market rate rent levels have dropped a bit in recent months. So if you could share with our listeners in your work performing market studies and working with clients, whether or not you're seeing any evidence of market rents getting anywhere near LIHTC rents in any areas. Once again, are you seeing any evidence of market rents getting anywhere near LIHTC rents in any areas?
No.
That's a simple answer. Please expand.
No, I'm done. No, I'm not. I have not seen it. I have what your article discussed, and what we're seeing in some markets is that market rents are not growing as much as they were growing before, but they're still increasing. And market rents would have to fall pretty far to compete with tax credit rents. So, and to expand on the data that you were sharing earlier, there's a huge need for affordable housing. I've been with Novogradac for 20 years now, and that need has been constant. Some markets there's more of a need than others, but generally speaking, we probably do about 2,500 studies a year, and what I generally see is that the vacancy rates for affordable housing are very low, usually below about 3%. There's long waiting lists. Sometimes the waiting lists could be years long. Some properties don't even keep waiting lists because there's such strong demand that it's not even necessary. The capture rates, when we're doing a market study, and a market study has a capture rate analysis, there's an analysis in there where you have to determine how many of the income eligible renter households the property would need to capture in order for the property to have adequate demand. Generally, it's below 10%. So the capture rates are very low. And we also see that there's very low turnover, particularly, but both in market rate and in affordable housing. But in affordable housing, usually the turnover rates, maybe they're between 15, 20%, which means that the tenants that have those affordable units, they don't usually vacate the units, or they rarely do. And it's because there's so few affordable housing options. So no, we're not seeing that the market rents would be competing with tax credit rents anytime soon.
So we're not seeing any effect yet, and maybe we won't ever see it anywhere. And when I say that, I want to note to our listeners, going on a bit of a tangent here, that LIHTC rents, as most of our listeners know, are generally set equal to or below, and most of the times below and sometimes well below, 30% of 60% of area median income. And when you think about 100% of area median income is the median, that's where half renters are above or below. So tax credit rents are 30% of 60% area median income, and then oftentimes they're more deeply skewed than that as part of the competition for getting the tax credits. And this means that if we do find that there are some areas where market rents did approach tax credit rents, then that would mean that housing is getting much more affordable and fewer households would be rent burdened, which would be great news for renter households in those areas. But to get back to the question of the effect of the recent rise in housing starts versus housing formations, Kelly, when you do think about the question, while you're not seeing anything now, Are there specific geographic regions or types of categories of affordable housing that you think would be most likely to be affected first by such an increase in housing supply?
Um, so increasing housing supply is good for tenants. Lowering rents is good for tenants. Increasing housing supply is also good for employers and the economy. What would make the rents fall low enough that they could compete with tax credit units? There'd have to be a large increase in inventory that would result in more competition, or there would have to be significant unemployment that would lower demand. When we look at areas across the country, we see that rents are generally higher, obviously in the big cities on the coast, and they're lower in middle America. One way that we look at how competitive the tax credit rents are with the market rents is to look at the market advantage. And I have two examples that I'll go into in a minute. But to insulate tax credit properties from competing against market rate properties, investors and state agencies, lenders, they always want to underwrite to a market advantage. And they want to see that any tax credit unit has at least a 10% discount to market. So if you have just picking a unit, if you had a 2-bedroom unit and the market rent for that unit was $1,000, they wouldn't want the tax credit rent to be above $900 because they want to make sure that there's a discount so that it's not going to compete. Market advantage, will differ based on location, income averaging, areas where there's a larger inventory. If there's more affordable units, it can vary based on a number of factors. We looked at over 40 deals in various markets because I wanted to see if there was a difference in the market advantage between 4% deals and 9% deals. And it's interesting because the range was pretty similar. The market advantage ranged from roughly 11 to 45%. So it was a minimum market advantage of 11% on all these deals that we looked at to a max of 45%, but the average was 28 to 29%. So in all of those over 40 markets that we looked at, the market advantage was roughly on average 28 to 29%. So we looked at a couple of examples to show how far rents would need to fall for the market rents to compete with the tax credit units. And one of the deals that we looked at was a 9% senior deal in Miami. This one, it's new construction. It had income averaging. So the units at that deal were at 40, 70, and 80% AMI. The 40% units had a 66% market advantage. The 80% units had a 29% market advantage. And with those units, looking at the 2 bedrooms, the 80% 2-bedroom unit was $1,662, and the market rent was $2,325. So to close in on that 10% advantage, the market rent would need to fall $430. So Miami is probably not your,
Right.
it's not representative of any market. There's a lot of foreign investor money in Miami, so it's pretty stable. The market rents, as a result, because of all that competition, the market rents are very high. But it does give you an example of how far the rents would need to fall. Probably if you were looking at other locations where they had income averaging and they had deals that were at 70, 80, 90% AMI, there could be some competition and there could be a smaller market advantage. Another deal that we looked at was a 4% conversion deal near Augusta, Maine. And that deal, we looked at the 2-bedroom, 60% AMI unit, and the rent for that unit was $1,017, and the market rent was $1,250. So that one had a 19% advantage. It was a lot closer than Miami. In that market, the market rent would need to come down about $108 to close in on the 10% advantage. And with a market like Augusta, Maine, they're probably there may not be as much diversification in the industries. You could have some heavy reliance on a couple of the major employers.
Right.
And, if you had a factory close or a business close, it's possible you could see that change in market rents come down a little bit, but, I don't think it's going to come down enough to close in on that 10% advantage.
So thank you for that. That's a good overview. It's on the one hand, if you're owner of a affordable rental housing properties, that gives you comfort. Obviously, if you're a tenant, it means there's not much hope anytime soon that the rent burden is going to fall unless you are successful in getting a tax credit unit. So one thing a lot of listeners are concerned about, something I'm concerned about for a variety of reasons, is the possibility of an economic recession. That is, of course, assuming we're not in one already. And I did discuss that topic briefly in my column, but I thought it'd be instructive for our listeners for you to share some of your experiences with a prior recession. And I say that because, as you noted, you've been with Novogradac for a while, and you were at Novogradac during the entirety of the Great Recession about 15 years ago. So please share with our listeners what you observed during that period, during the Great Recession, and to what extent you think how the Great Recession affected tax credit properties might be instructive as to what we could experience with another recession.
Sure. So as you know, recessions can be very different. The National Bureau of Economic Research Business Cycle Dating Committee, considered by the federal government to be the official recession scorekeeper, defines a recession as a significant decline in economic activity that is spread across the economy and lasts more than a few months. So the Great Recession lasted from December 2007 to June 2009, so it was 18 months long. And the housing market crash was caused by excessive mortgage lending. The bursting of the housing bubble increased the number of renter households and led to only a minor dip in market rents. In 2007, I have a couple of statistics.
Okay.
In 2007, the average rent was $968. And in 2010, it was $943. So that's a 3.5% drop. By contrast, the average home price in that same period dropped from $254,000 to $218,000, which is a 14.2% decrease. It seems like the rents were more insulated due to owner-occupied households being forced into renting, creating more rental demand as the recession went on. How did tax credit properties do in that time frame? In 2008, the national average occupancy for 60% tax credit units was 96.3%, and it dropped to 95.4%, less than a percentage point change when the recession ended and the employment low was in 2009. So if you compare that to the pandemic recession was only 2 months long, but everything came to a halt.
It did.
In the pandemic recession, market rate properties, we saw market rate properties in high income urban areas like New York and San Francisco experience temporary rent decreases. There were some increases to market rate vacancy, but it didn't last very long, and it's since corrected. But we did see when the market rents came down in some of those markets that it was an opportunity for tenants. Tenants could lease units, negotiate their rents, and get something a little bit lower. By the end of 2021, tax credit occupancy was a record high of 98.5% for 2-bedroom units for properties for tenants earning 60% of AMI or less, according to data compiled by Novogradac. And the tax credit rent had grown at a rate of 2.3 and 6.1% over 2020 and 2021. So what might happen with a recession? With any recession, cuts to discretionary income to people's personal budgets leads to impacts in various sectors. But typically you'll see the retail, the travel and tourism sector, manufacturing and construction retail sector affected by a recession. So I would say that markets that are reliant on those industries would have more exposure in a recession. I'm thinking of Orlando, Las Vegas, markets like that would be more likely to see a change.
That makes total sense. And you were mentioning how during the Great Recession, the average rent dropped 3.5%, with home prices 14.2% on average. As I noted in my intro, and as we've discussed, you and I, on various occasions, as well as in preparing for the podcast, that obviously are the national averages, and local conditions led to some pretty wide swings in what some of those averages were. But overall, those were the results. And as you noted, the LIHTC properties became all the more valuable in terms of being able to afford the rent. And something we noticed, which I know that you saw during the pandemic, which is also similar to the Great Recession, is when you do have an affordable rental unit and you're a lower income family, to a certain extent during a recession or during the pandemic, having that discounted rent is all the more valuable. So there's great efforts are made to retain the unit and pay the rent. But we've mentioned several times during the course of the podcast, while that the LIHTC properties are generally fairly insulated from the supply and demand equation, at least more recently, and recessions and the recessions in general, pandemic caused, or housing over lending on home ownership and the rest. But if I am a sponsor or owner of a proposed loan goes attached for a property, do I look at all this, what we've talked about so far, and say I really don't have to worry about it? Or there's some things I should be doing in light of this recent data?
Yeah, I think that when you're focusing on a market, you would want to consider, what industries are most prevalent in that market. How are they doing? At-risk markets, relying on the industries that I mentioned earlier, have more exposure in a downturn. Industries with more stability, like, state, local government, healthcare, education, those types of industries have, they're more insulated from a recession. Like Washington, D.C. is a really good example. I live there. The housing market is always strong there. This year we started to see some layoffs in the tech industry, but not enough that I'd be concerned about, large decreases in market rents yet. I think that, if you're looking at a market, you're looking at doing a deal, I'd look at additions to supply as well. Is looking at what the industries are in that market, see if there's been a large increase. Do some research, consider the needs of the market. Where is there great need? Something that we have clients ask us to do quite a bit are preliminary studies, and they may have an idea of a market or a type of product, but they might need some assistance to see if their theories can be proven true. So maybe they're thinking that there's more demand for a senior deal or a family deal, or certain bedroom types or AMI levels. And so sometimes we'll do these preliminary studies, and it's helpful for developers before they move forward with their application, and helps them know if there's demand for their deal and what the rents would look like, and is there enough market advantage. Also we would look at capture rate thresholds that some states might have to make sure that there's no issue with that. So, that's something that we can do. And to kind of follow up on a point that you mentioned earlier, I'm kind of interested to see, I mentioned that during the pandemic recession, we saw some decreases in rent in markets like New York and San Francisco, going a little bit off topic. And there were some people that left some of those areas and they relocated to other parts of the country, and they could do some remote work. So I'm, curious what will happen in the new rent and income limits when they're released in May, if we'll see any sort of a change there, if there'll be any sort of a decrease in AMI levels and rents in some of those markets where you had a lot of workers, where they left and they went to, outlying suburbs, or they went south or whatever, to see what kind of a change there was. So that'll be interesting to see after the data is available in May.
Yes, it is. Yes, it will be, I should say. So it sounds like from a recession perspective, you would just say developers, investors, owners are always sensitive to changes in jobs, but maybe in a recession be particularly sensitive to those areas, those job sectors that are most likely to be impacted by a recession, which could be affecting demand. Sounds like on the recession side, that's one of the critical components. Then you also mentioned from a supply perspective, you have national averages and all the rest, but maybe pay a little bit more close attention to housing starts projected, those housing starts that have occurred and housing starts that are projected, which obviously one of the ways of looking at that is looking at permits and things of that nature on the supply side. And it sounds like you're also saying, layering into that, the type of property that you're looking to develop, just to see within that subset of subsets to what extent there's demonstrable demand for that. And I'm sure that it's the exception where there isn't demonstrable demand, but it can happen depending upon the unique aspects of a local market, because obviously even within a county or a city and all the rest, you really have to get down to the local market where the property is located, and then you can get a little bit more more extreme situations.
Right. Yeah. We'll look at permit data, like you mentioned. We'll look at, we'll speak with planners, look at additions to supply, and then try and get more information on what are those additions to supply, what are they developing. Look at allocation data to see if there have been new tax credit allocations, find out where those deals are. If someone's, building a tax credit deal right down the street from you, and it's similar to yours, or it's going to take away from your tenants, the tenants that you would lease to, it's going to be problematic. So those are things you want to know about.
And we could go on a lot of different tangents here, not the least of which would be, the band of what band of tenants are available at the restricted rents, income levels, and all the rest. But I won't go into all of that.
Yep.
So I want to thank you, Kelly, for joining me on the podcast. You provided some good insight into what we know, and more importantly, what we don't know, and about recent housing trends and the effects they'll have on affordable housing property. And you've given some good advice as to how developers, investors, owners ought to be addressing their development, the projects that are in their pipeline, as well as their projects that are already up and operating. I will say to our listeners, I will include Kelly's email address in the show notes. If you want to reach out to her to discuss in more detail some of the factors we discussed in the course of the podcast, please email her. As Kelly has demonstrated, our valuation team is outstanding at identifying changing market conditions. And as she noted, we do roughly 2,500 market studies a year. So there's a pretty good chance we've done one or more market studies in the areas where you're looking to develop. So Kelly, please stick around for our off mic section.
Sure.
I'm going to ask you some off-topic questions that our listeners will find helpful, and I always do.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. No, it's good to have you on. And then to our listeners, I want to encourage you to join next week. My guest will be my partner, Dirk Wallace, and he's going to talk about recent IRS guidance concerning the affordable housing provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. That legislation enacted last year created a 20% bonus credit for renewable energy that's located in low-income communities. This means that the investment tax credit for renewable energy in a low-income community could go from a 30% credit to a 50% credit. However, that extra 20% to go from 30% to 50% is capped at 1.8 gigawatts, and the housing community has been waiting for guidance on how to apply for that bonus credit. Well, the IRS recently released guidance, including how to apply for the 200 megawatt set aside for federally subsidized buildings, which includes those financed by the low-income housing tax credit. My partner Dirk will be here to provide context for what's involved in the application process and what developers of existing or proposed low-income housing tax credit properties should be doing now to prepare to apply for those credits. If you're involved in any part of the affordable rental housing community, you'll certainly want to tune into next week's podcast to stay informed about how to get this extra 20% bonus credits for renewable energy. And now we reach our off-mic section where I get to ask guests some off-topic questions to get their advice and words of wisdom. And I'll start with one of my popular questions for my guests, and that is, what do you know now, Kelly, that you wish you knew at the beginning of your professional career?
So I wish that I knew that it was okay to ask a lot of questions when we have newer people that we're working with, new hires. I'm always praising them for, asking questions. At the same time, you want to make sure that you're researching, things on your own before you're asking the question. I know if I were to ask you a question, you will say, well, what do you think? And people say that about you all the time. If you ask him a question, he's going to say, what do you think? So research it a little bit on your own, but then, ask questions and learn as much as you possibly can.
No, that's great advice about not being afraid to ask questions. And it's not just questions about, application of valuation principles or tax principles or audit principles or the rest. A lot of it is like, when would you like this back? How much time?
Yeah.
A lot of very basic questions about, don't assume, and just ask lots of questions in that way, and seek guidance.
Actually, so I had read recently, if I can jump in, I read that one of the best time savers for you and for others is when you're asking someone to do something in the email, always indicate what your time expectation is.
Yep.
And it will save you and them possibly a lot of drama. So that's a really good point that you had.
Yeah, there's definitely all about how it is when you're accepting a project, how you should accept the project. And obviously that's also says how you should delegate a project, but you want the delegator to be thinking of those issues. You want the person recipients to be thinking about those issues. And then, like you said, don't be afraid to ask questions. Even if you think it's a dumb question, you should still ask it. So thank you for that. And I only have 2 questions for you, so I have one more here. And I always like hearing leadership lessons that my fellow partners have learned over the years. And I was wondering what important leadership lesson you've learned. I don't say the most important, because then you start getting a lot of metaphysical sorts of questions. But if you just say a important leadership lesson that you've learned.
I think it's really important to recognize the achievements of others. I don't think that, for me, I'm not doing things completely on my own. We have a team of people that we work with, and everyone's contributing, and everyone always appreciates getting an email or a call with a thank you, or you did a good job, or to let others know what someone else did, what their contribution was. So I think give praise when it's due is yes. Really good lesson.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me when very early in my career, I remember learning the concept of you should recognize and praise, and you should praise in public. And there's everyone, even who's raised a child or the rest, you hear about how when you look at if you look at the critiques versus the praise, the critiques tend to outweigh the praise. It should be substantially the other direction. So the concept of praising in public, but also if you're going to give constructive criticism, that's better done in private.
Yes, I agree. And actually Friday, I think you sent an email on Friday. Was it Employee Appreciation Day?
Yes,
Thinking
it was.
about that actually. Yeah, we got an email about that.
Yes, it was.
Our gifts, what gifts we want to pick.
That's correct. So thank you again, Kelly, for joining me on the podcast today. And to our listeners, I'm Mike Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.